Hey, folks, greetings from the offensive security team here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today, you've got myself, Brad, and Mr. Tyler here with us, and we're going to be talking about types of risk. And this is a common topic of conversation with regard to the penetration testing world that we live in. It's interesting to note that we see all of these different types of risk in many cases in a single report, and we end up having to have a lot of conversations with clients about these types of risk and how they apply to the vulnerabilities or issues that we find in penetration testing. And so, Tyler, this is kind of your brainchild, man. Tell me a little bit about what your motivation was for putting this together and why you wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, I think the initial motivation was a few weeks ago. We had a client that we were doing a pen test against, and we had a WordPress vulnerability that came up. And I think you and I had a discussion around that vulnerability that we wanted to provide additional context to the client on before the report got sent to them so that they're not freaking out about a high risk WordPress vulnerability, since the risk isn't a direct risk to their organization. It's more so a reputational risk to their organization. And a direct risk that's a high risk vulnerability carries a lot different weight than a
It
high risk
does.
vulnerability that is simply reputational risk. They're both, a high risk at the end of the day. So they both do present some harm to your organization if not fixed, but they carry different weights. Um, so that was kind of the initial brain thought. And I also, common vulnerability tools, like your Nessus, and other tools like that, they don't really dive into what the actual risk associated with the vulnerability with, right? They're just trying to give you information surrounding that vulnerability and a rating from CVSS, but additional context into, what risk that vulnerability actually brings, a lot of those tools lack. And so I kind of just wanted to go through the different types of risks that we commonly see and kind of give some examples of those.
Mhm. So you hit a key word, and I beat this like a drum, right? And that is context is everything. And when we're talking about vulnerabilities, and I'll give like the easiest example in the world, right? So if we find SQL injection on an application, pre-authentication, right? So on the public portion of the website, that's huge, right? That means anybody with or without an account on a publicly accessible system could theoretically interact with the database.
Hmm.
That's a big deal. And let's say, by contrast, we find a SQL injection vulnerability that's only in the admin portion behind MFA. There's only two users that are admins on that system. you know, yeah, that's still technically from a CVSS perspective going to be a pretty risky thing, but the context behind that is completely different, right? And so I would prioritize a post authentication SQL injection issue over a pre authentication SQL injection issue. And we would also take other things into consideration. Is there client data in the application, sensitive information in the application? The number of users matters, the accessibility of the application. If it's an internal only application, then again, context matters and the amount and type of risk can change based on all of those parameters. And to your point, no scanner, no tool, is going to take that kind of stuff into consideration. And so that's kind of a big part of our role as penetration testers is to interpret the true risk and the type of risk associated with a specific vulnerability or issue. So let's talk about the first one. You've already mentioned reputational risk, right? That's at the top of our list in the show
Hmm.
notes. So tell me a little bit about how you're communicating that with the clients and what that looks like for you.
Yeah, typically when we see reputational risk on, we'll just say external pen tests, because that's where you're going to see the most reputational risks.
Mhm.
It's on most oftentimes third party resources that are segmented from the organization's internal networks, right? They
Yep.
still have the organization's name on them. The organization still owns them, but they're segmented, right? And so when you see vulnerabilities on those types of applications, what you're really seeing is attackers, in their mind, the risk comes from them wanting to deface the website, and cause harm to the organization's brand, which
hmm
would, insert that reputational risk. So a lot of the times when we see those types of vulnerabilities, that's kind of the scenario behind it.
hmm Yeah, so there's some other examples that come to mind for me. One of the ones that we haven't seen in a while, but we used to see more often, is open mail relays. So clients with open mail relays are allowing um, unauthenticated third parties to forward mail through their SMTP server, or whatever mail system that they're using. And we've actually seen like material damages come from that in the real world. So back in my previous life, when I worked in the financial world, we were having hackers send phishing emails through mail relays of our third party vendors. And what would end up happening is the spam systems would pick up on that and they would blacklist the entire domain. And so now that third party could no longer send email because it was getting redirected to spam. And so, imagine you as an organization, and your primary role in life is to send, email notifications to customers, and now everything's being marked as spam and redirected. So another one that is kind of unique. We've only seen this once, but it was pretty wild. Jordan, another pen tester on my team, was doing Google research on an organization, and 80% of the Google findings were pornography for that client. And so what ended up happening is a subdomain for that client had been taken over by someone that was, getting paid to market, you know, um, pornography. And so when you searched for this client's name in Google, the entire first page was just covered up with explicit results. And so there are a lot of ways for reputational risk to present itself. I think those are three really good examples.
Hmm.
And things that, especially the WordPress one, man, we see that all the time. WordPress is such a pile of junk. It's it's still probably the most prolific CMS out there, but man, the number of vulnerabilities that come out for WordPress and its plugins is just outrageous. And so, it's frequently targeted by hackers. It's difficult to keep up to date, and it does pose, real reputational risk. So,
Yeah, because if somebody is posting pornography under your name, you're driving potential business away. And so a lot of the times when we're presenting, um, risks that come from third parties and stem from third parties, there's a lot less initiative and drive to get those fixed versus
mhm,
the risks that are sitting on an organization's, anything an organization owns that's under their umbrella and not a third party.
yeah.
And the inherent risk on third party is still there and it's still substantial when you can do things like that with vulnerabilities on those third party applications.
Sure. And they're harder to fix sometimes, right? When you don't control the infrastructure and you don't control the system and you're having to communicate with third parties, and that's the case with WordPress a lot too, is where you're hiring a third party to host it and manage it for you, but they're not doing that well. Solving that is difficult. So and one other thing I'll mention before we move on is quantifying reputational risk is nearly impossible. And so, putting values on that, like for example, how many clients did that law firm potentially lose
Mm.
because because people searched for them on Google and went on to someone else who was not hosting pornography, for example. And so you can't know that. And same thing with all of the different reputational examples that we've given. You just don't know what that impact is. It could be substantial. It could be minimal. So quantifying that's difficult. So let's move on to the next type of risk, financial risk, right? And I want to also, before we jump into that, so there doesn't always have to be a singular type of risk. So a vulnerability, in most cases, in fact, falls into multiple categories that we're going to talk about today.
Mhm.
So I would argue that reputational risk and financial risk have some overlay there, right?
Mhm.
Reputational risk could cause you to lose clients. It could cause you not to get new clients. There are a lot of ways that can manifest itself, and specifically, it can manifest itself as financial risk because you're either losing business or not gaining business. So specifically, though, what is financial risk? What are you defining that as? I guess.
So, like monetary loss from either a vulnerability or a vulnerability that leads to a security breach.
Yeah.
So, losing money because there's a vulnerability out there.
Yeah. This one is more quantifiable. This was an exercise that we spent a lot of time with in the financial world, discussing, how do you put a dollar value on a vulnerability, right? In a lot of cases, there are definitely formulas out there. We won't go into those in this episode, but in many cases, you can describe the monetary value of a specific system, right? So one database, for example, or one application, you can tie a monetary value to that. Like, how much money did that thing make in the last year? Divide that by 12. That's your monthly. And then, that system, if it were to be taken down for 2 weeks, you kind of have an idea of how much money it would cost the organization. It's not always that simple, but it is a way to prioritize issues and vulnerabilities, is when you can quantify it with a financial value. um, One of the things that you have listed here that I think is fascinating is increased insurance premiums. So, like, dude, think about that for a second. Like, insurance right now, cyber insurance is insane. It is difficult to get. It's expensive when you do. The bar is very high with regards to deliverables that are owed to the insurance underwriters. And in most cases, unfortunately, and I'm not picking on the insurance industry, but like, in most cases, the underwriters have no understanding of cybersecurity. Right? They're checking a list, man,
Hmm.
because they're not hiring cybersecurity engineers to underwrite policies. And so you have to present your best foot forward to these cyber insurance companies in order to get a good rate and get good coverage. And, you know, that's kind of a downstream financial issue for your organization if you are not practicing solid cybersecurity hygiene. So, yeah, very cool. Intellectual property is another one that you mentioned. We work with a lot of clients who have secret sauce, and if someone were to steal that, the financial risk of that would be huge, right? And that's a real thing. The industrial espionage is a real thing in our world. So,
Yeah, I think another thing that's not listed there is lack or inefficient business continuity plans
yeah.
that can cause substantial financial risk.
Oh, absolutely, dude. Absolutely. And that's something that is moderately quantifiable, I would imagine. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I agree with that. All right, so let's talk about operational risk. How are you defining that, and like, give me an example of how you would explain what that would look like in an event.
So that's going to be any risk pertaining to day to day operations being affected.
Hmm.
Um,
This is a
and
Go ahead, go ahead.
go ahead. No, you're good.
Well, this is a good example of where we're combining risk types. So if your organization was taken offline, let's say by ransomware, right, for example, or another great example, or is having a major incident. And so not only are you having operational risk, in other words, you can't do business, but it also has a material financial impact. It also has a reputational impact. So that this is a really good example of the type of risk that would have far-reaching effects, which would be, we would say, classified in multiple ways.
Mm.
But yeah, yeah, having your organization taken down, denial of service, defaced web pages, stuff like that, where you can't do business. This one's huge, and that actually, this one also, I think, ties back to having a good BCP, or DR plan. So there's a lot involved in that.
Yeah, because I think there's a hospital that we know about that had they had a cybersecurity incident recently, and I think they've been offline, like pen and paper offline systems for I don't know 2 or 3 months now, and all of these risks tie into that because like they're all active now. All these risks are coming to light.
Yeah.
And, I think the biggest thing for operational risk to help mitigate operational risks is having that business continuity plan and knowing what to happen when, crap hits the fan.
No, you're absolutely right, man. And that's something that, generally speaking, we don't address in penetration testing, although it does occasionally come up. But yeah, I mean, it speaks to a more broad cybersecurity overall practice. Having BCP and DR. If you got a good BCP, hopefully you don't need your DR plan. But All right, so to me, and this is just me talking. This is not the CISSP classification, any of that stuff. But those first three that we've already talked about are kind of the high level broad categories. Most types of risk will fall into at least those three categories, and then the rest of these are kind of subcategories of risk, right? So in most cases, you're going to start with that high level. It's reputational, it's financial, it's operational, and then you will subclassify it with the next couple that we'll talk about. And the first one is direct risk. So this is probably the easiest to understand and the easiest to talk about, because if there's a vulnerability on a system and it's exploited, it directly impacts that system.
Mhm.
And so, that direct risk, probably, would you say it's the most common type that we deal with, I think, as a subcategory?
When I think of like internal pen testing, I think nearly everything is a direct risk.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. That makes sense. And so yeah, I mean, direct risk is pretty straightforward. It's going to impact that system specifically, but in most cases there may also be indirect risk, right? And so by contrast to direct risk, this is kind of a downstream effect. For example, if if your backup plan doesn't work, right? If your database backup is broken, then and you do have an incident, like, it's going to impact your ability to bring that back, and your recovery is going to be a struggle. But it goes a little bit further than that, in my opinion. It can also indirectly impact other aspects of the organization, right? So let's talk about, I think WordPress is a great example of this, because if someone were to gain control of your main website, for example, they now have the ability to host malicious content, which could be distributed not only to you but your clients. They now have the ability to potentially create phishing attacks that leverage the actual site itself, which is extremely valuable to attackers who are leveraging phishing as initial access. And so there are a lot of these kind of indirect attacks that will present themselves should the risk of a specific system become realized.
Mhm.
And so, same thing with, like we were talking about with the SMTP, mail relay. Not only the risk of all of those emails impacting you guys, but then of course you can't do business. And so there are probably always going to be indirect risks associated with a specific type of vulnerability. But understanding what those are requires a thorough understanding, I think, of your entire infrastructure, all of the moving parts of your environment. Comes back to asset management. It also comes back to knowing what you have, especially in the cloud. That's one of the things that I think a lot of clients miss on is, yeah, we're all we're doing is hosting the our Active Directory. We're using Entra ID. It's no big deal. It's not a lot of stuff. Yeah, but what's the downstream impact of that, right? Are you exposing the ability for us to credential stuff and password spray? Well, we're effectively creating an indirect link to your on-prem Active Directory in a hybrid environment.
Mhm.
Now that indirect impact of us attacking Entra ID becomes substantial inside your organization. So there are a lot of variations of this.
Especially like, I think an indirect risk of that would be if you stand up any applications that give an internal foothold from an external application. I'm thinking of something like Horizon. If you
Yep.
have Horizon SSO'd back, then, the indirect risk of, just having Entra ID in those accounts and being SSO'd would be those accounts being leveraged through SSO to get an internal foothold.
Yeah. Yep.
Also
Yeah.
think of direct risk. I think about Kerberostable accounts in an internal environment, and just that all the indirect risk that can come from an account being Kerberosted and being leveraged in an internal environment that way. I think those would be two good examples of direct and indirect risks.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, man. And it's wild, especially in the internal world, that just gaining access to a singular account on a server somewhere turns into full domain admin two steps later. And so and one of the things that we face a lot on the internal, I kind of wish Spencer was here to speak more to it, but one of the things that we face a lot on internal pen tests is clients downplaying a specific issue. And so, for example, if we were to find credentials on a share somewhere inside of an environment, and maybe those credentials only give you RDP access to a local privileged account on a server somewhere, and they're like, "Oh, there's really nothing important on that server." And then we go log into it, and it's got cached admin credentials. It's running services as system, and all of these other downstream things. Now just an innocent file sitting on a file share somewhere has turned into indirectly complete access to everything in your environment. And
Mm-hmm.
understanding what those are, and I think that actually segues beautifully into the next one, right? Which is lateral risk, and I think indirect and lateral risk have some overplay. But tell me a little bit about what your thought process is on lateral risk.
Yeah. So, when you think of lateral movement, I think is another good way to think about it. Like when you go from one resource to another, or you use one vulnerability to affect more systems, that would be a lateral risk. I think Spencer had a great example of this, either last week or the week before last, when he found an application that was kind of like the mothership for this organization. And using that application, he had the ability to push out, I think it was software to every computer,
Hmm.
end user device in their environment.
Yeah, and so some other examples that we see of that are being able to upload malicious files in a web application pen test, for example. Earlier this year, we were working on a pen test with a pretty big, a global financial organization, and we were testing in their supposedly their test environment, right? But what we didn't realize, and what I don't even know that they realized, is that file uploads were landing in their production system. So even though the application was running in a test environment, the database was a test database. We try to isolate ourselves so that we don't cause problems. But we uploaded a web shell, and when we traced back the path of where the web shell was, and we opened it up and did a who am I, we were running as a root on their production file store, kind of in the middle of the organization with access to literally everything. And so, that's a great example where a test system, which we've talked about this before, especially with clients, where people will say, "Oh, it's a dev system, it's a test system. There's no
Hmm.
production data there." That's cool, man. But guess what is there? Credentials, sessions, all these other things, and then to top it all off, we're now offloading files from test system into production. That is a significant lateral risk to your environment, and now this seemingly insignificant thing becomes a pretty major issue. And so you have to understand the interactivity and interoperability between these systems in order to properly understand lateral risk.
Yep. I think that goes to show another point that like dev systems are, I think 9 times out of 10, some of the most insecure systems we see,
Oh,
and externally,
absolutely.
if we ever see those, it's a number 1 write-up in our reports because
Yeah, yeah, we
those
get
systems
excited about that, man.
always have vulnerabilities, and clients always come back and say the same thing, "Well, it's a dev system, it's a test environment, nothing on here is not gonna be pushed to prod, like, everything on here is secure and it's fine," and a lot of times that is just not the case.
I'm sure they believe that with all of their heart, right?
Mhm.
I'm sure they do. I'll give you another great example of a test environment going sideways on somebody. Is we were I think this was a healthcare organization. This is like 2 years ago. It's been a while, but we were in their environment. This is an internal penetration test, but we were looking at some of their apps, and their production web application environment was locked down super tight. Like we were getting nowhere with it, right? And so we pivoted over to their dev environment, and we were able to gain access to their dev environment. And um, and so anyway, what we found is they were reusing passwords. So their development environment had the same SA password, the same application key as their production environment. And so we then used that to pivot over to production, And lo and behold, we were able to gain access to everything. So yeah, we should be guarding dev and test with the same level of scrutiny that we do everything else.
Mhm.
So there's kind of two more types, and I'm going to roll these together just a little bit. Strategic and compliance risk, right? And so strategic risk is basically just your inability to reach strategic goals, right? And so this could be, the first thing that pops into my head when we're talking about this is the inability to go live in a web app. So I used to live in that world day in and day out when I worked in the financial industry, and I would be the guy who had to tell the dev team, "Sorry, your app is so busted up that you can't go live with it." And now we've communicated to clients. We've had like launch parties for this new app. Everybody's excited about it. We've got millions of dollars invested in it. And here comes this jerk who says we can't go live. And strategically, negatively, I mean, I always
Mhm.
hate being that guy, but the reality is you can't go live with an application full of issues like that, right? And so strategically, it would negatively impact the organization, right? And this usually is felt the most at executive and project management levels. Um, and so the last one is compliance risk. I think people downplay this a little bit, but it is important. So tell me a little bit about what your perspective is on that, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So if you're in non-compliance with anything, you risk failing to adhere to laws, regulations, industry standards, those types of things. And, the risk that that carries is not necessarily like somebody getting access to your systems. This isn't something that we typically see on pen tests, but, more so the risk is legal penalties, fines, damage to business operations. Because if you ever lose a compliance standard, that's a huge deal to organizations.
Oh yeah.
Um, so
And I'll tell you, in the financial world, the Fed will shut you down. They will literally flip the switch and you are no longer an operating bank. It can be that serious, right? To your point, HIPAA's really big on fining hospitals and healthcare organizations. So there is a large scale impact to this, and it's one of the reasons that most people have in-house compliance teams once they reach a certain size, is to ensure that. So yeah, so that's important as well. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. If you like what we're doing and you enjoy it, please like, share, subscribe. The most important thing you can do for us is tell a peer about the podcast and let them know what we're about. And we'll see you next Wednesday.